Hey everyone, welcome to this week's episode of the Thrive with Asbury Seminary podcast, where every other week we bring you conversations with authors, thought leaders, and people just like you to help you connect with where your passion meets the world's deep need. This week on the podcast, we're bringing you a conversation with three guests. Dr. Mark Yarhouse, Professor and Chair of Wheaton School of Psychology, Dr. Janet Dean, Associate Professor at Asbury University, and Dr. Steve Stratton, Professor of Counseling and Pastoral Care at Asbury Seminary. Each of our guests is very accomplished in his or her field, and I encourage you to check out the show notes for their complete bios and links to the books that they've written. I'm very excited about today's conversation. For more than a decade, this group has researched the experience of sexual minorities at faith-based colleges and universities, exploring the intersection of faith and sexuality. Their research led them to publish a book, Listening to Sexual Minorities. In today's conversation, we'll learn more about their research, their findings, and ways that we can engage the culture with intentionality, civility, and mature love. Let's listen. Well, I am so happy that you all could join us today. I'm really excited about our conversation, and this is my first time to have three podcast guests at once, so I'm really excited, and yeah, so it's going to be a great conversation. So if we could just go around and the three of you could briefly introduce yourself, that would be awesome. So we can start with you, Dr. Yarhouse.
Sure. So I'm Mark Yarhouse. I'm a professor of psychology at Wheaton College, and I direct the Sexual and Gender Identity Institute there.
Very nice. Dr. Stratton?
Dr. Steve Stratton. I'm professor of Counseling and Pastoral Care at Asbury Theological Seminary, and really glad to be a part of this research team.
Mm-hmm. And I'm Janet Dean. I'm an associate professor of psychology at Asbury University, and then teach as an adjunct over here at Asbury Seminary.
Okay.
And I'm glad to be part of this team too. We've been together 14, 15 years now.
It's kind of amazing.
Yeah, that's awesome. I'm glad you cross the street on a regular basis. Yeah, so I'm excited to talk about your research today. You've been investigating the experience of sexual minorities on faith-based colleges and universities. So how did you become interested in this topic?
You know, the interesting thing about this, I think we've all been interested in this topic at different points. I think it's come up, but in some ways, our research partnership got launched actually across the street at Asbury University.
Really?
We had invited Mark to come and speak, and
it was. I had only been at the school for a year, so
Okay.
I'm brand new when this all happens.
And so Janet and I were both in the counseling center over there.
So when did it get started? What year?
Oh, I don't know.
I think I came in 2005, I want to say.
Right, because I started in 2004.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
Okay.
So that's where it got, and it really began as we were thinking, wouldn't it be good to have some data about the campus? Mark and a grad student of his had worked on a survey, and so we thought, let's see if we can put it to use in preparation for Mark's Staley lecture series and some other things that were happening. And so that was actually our first survey together, was looking at the data for Asbury University at that time, and so that it would inform the conversation. And then after everything was done, we just continued to converse and think about some of these things together, and launched from there. Actually, the survey we did in another iteration became the survey that became part of our first research study together, I think.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So this study has been going on for 14 years now? Is that?
I would say our collaboration has
Yeah, your
been. So there's
collaboration.
like a line of research is the way I would think about that. And a line of research will have multiple studies. So we have the one that is featured in the book, Listening to Sexual Minorities, is the first 2 years of a larger study, and we've been continuing that out to 4 years. But we had done other studies that go back 10 years but they're different independent studies in a line of research, because I think we keep realizing we could ask better questions every time we do a survey.
It's true.
Okay, we can do this better. So.
Well, tell me about your research. What is the structure of your study, and what is its purpose?
Well, I can talk a little bit about that. The research that we gathered for the book actually has two parts, if you will. One was an online survey that asked all sorts of questions, some about students, just their own sense of self and how they identify and what they experience, and how they've moved through these sexual markers in their life, and about their faith and their mental health and how they perceive their campus. It had all sorts of questions like that. And then after they complete that, they have a choice. They can say, I'd be interested in being interviewed, or I wouldn't be. And so for those who were interested in being interviewed, they were then contacted by the research team and participated in 45-minute to hour-and-a-half long interviews.
Wow.
Where they shared some of their story with us.
Wow.
And so then data analysis, you have the more objective survey part, but then we have the more difficult, what I think, analysis of the interview data.
Wow, so you're actually hearing their voices and their perspective too.
That's been a really rich part for me in the process. We've done a lot of the qualitative analysis here at the seminary, and so a lot of many of our students have been involved in that. And it's been just a rich experience to be in a person's life, with permission, of course, but in a person's life, and to hear their story in their voice, from their perspective. And it's not unusual to hear our students here at the seminary say, "This is quite an honor, a privilege to hear these stories in this way." And some of them have great funny things that are part of it. Other ones are just poignant and very even passionate. So you get that person and their experience, but it's really beautiful in a lot of ways. And for our students, it's been one of those things that I think they walk away feeling like I've really heard the voices of people who've been trying to navigate this intersection of things. It's been great for our students.
Hey, you mentioned the intersection, and your research talks about the complications of living at the intersection of faith and sexuality. What do you mean by the intersection? I have some follow-up questions to that too, but let's start with, what do you mean by that intersection?
Well, one of the images that Steve's team came up with, really from analyzing the data, was the idea that the students are kind of holding these different aspects of their identity, so their sexuality and their faith. And the image that his team came up with was, when you move in on campus to your residence hall and you're carrying boxes onto campus to kind of move in, you're sort of holding these boxes. And if you will, one of those boxes is your sexuality, and one of those boxes is your religious faith. And so the idea that, how do you hold these two things, and you don't want to spill the contents of either of them all over and draw a lot of attention to yourself. You're trying to figure it out. And so that we is carried further in a lot of different ways throughout our writing to sort of share images of how people kind of put those things together or make sense of those two things. But that's been a pretty common way to talk about it.
How are you finding that students negotiate that intersection through your research?
Well, they do it differently. One of the things that really stood out to me is that there's no one student navigating these issues. There's quite a diversity of experiences. One of the things that really stood out to me. If there's one thing that I would say that they hold in common, is that they take their faith seriously, and they take their sexuality seriously, and they take the relationship between the two seriously.
Yes.
And I think that was a surprise for us, wasn't it? We really expected that students would end up setting one of those boxes down, and we found very few did that.
And I think that we expected it because general culture kind of said that's the best. You're going to have to drop one of these in order to negotiate it. So we went in anticipating that we'd find it, but within the sample we had, hardly anybody did that. Not in this group, and I think it's because, as Mark's saying, they were people who valued both so highly. They are working very hard to figure out, how do I hold on to both of these without dropping them.
Obviously, every person would do it differently, but what were some of the bigger ways you found that students are integrating those two?
We did find some patterns that we oftentimes talk about. In the book, we talk about them as holding patterns, or these boxes. And I think we won't go into all of the detail about those things, but I think what we found was that the majority of people were trying to integrate them in some way. And so they were holding on to both and trying to find ways to negotiate them that would allow them to hang on to both. And there were different ways of trying to do that. Probably the one that we have found across time, and Jenna, you may speak to this more, but is the one that seems to have the most unsettledness about it was what we talked about as this kind of a two-box method. It was this sense of trying to hold on to both, and they're interacting, but it's almost like they're big and they're awkward, and there's a lot of friction that's still going on between them, and I don't really have a good way of holding on to these very well. And so this one seems to be the one that, in comparison with the other one, has the most distress associated with it. It's like there's not a structure. And then there are two other ones that we have that have unique structures with them. There's one that kind of has, we talk about in the book, as box within a box. And it's the idea that there's sort of this superordinate sort of structure that helps me understand how to hold these. So for some people, it's their religious and spiritual view. That's the framework that gives order to these two boxes. And there's the other one. There are some people where sexuality and their sexual experience is what really gives order to these boxes. They're holding on to both, but one's a little bit more dominant in the way that works, the way they order those kind of things. And then there's another one that it's a little bit more it seems to be a little bit more flexible and dynamic, where they don't have kind of one that orders it, but it seems to be more contextually driven. And so all of those three are integrating. We did have a few, though, that we had one where it's like they just didn't know what to do with the boxes, and so they would they weren't even interacting. It's kind of like they were very compartmentalized.
Yeah.
So my sexuality is over here, my faith is over here, but they don't interact. And then the other one was more along the line what we hear from general culture is that they've just dropped one of the boxes. It's like it may be somebody from a very from a religious or spiritual community that just says, I will not be a sexual person, in that way, or somebody who's coming from a community that values the sexuality aspect of it to the exception of the religion and spirituality, and they're just saying, I know what my background was, but I'm just not religious or spiritual anymore, in some ways. So there's a lot of ways, and I think that was the piece that was, like Mark and Janet were saying, is that there's just not a monolithic view in the holding patterns or in the people. It's really interesting that it's so dynamic and different, even across these that hold faith and their sexuality, and say, I've got to find a way to negotiate this.
And I would add some of the later analyses that we did looking at this. The folks who set one down, or the people who hold them completely apart, even though they're holding both of them, in some way, both of those are ways to manage cognitive dissonance. Integrating them are ways to manage cognitive dissonance. But that group where they're holding both and they're in conflict, they haven't managed that dissonance. And I think that's why we see the increased anxiety and just the struggle in them.
I think that's
they
our
haven't
suspicion.
found some kind of way to resolve that for themselves.
Yeah. So you mentioned your book, and that's a good segue into my next question. Did you know you were going to write a book based on your research, and what led you to write Listening to Sexual Minorities?
I think Steve and I would answer Mark.
We, in many ways, followed Mark's lead on this one.
I don't know that we thought we were going to write a book at any time until very recently, because these were just studies that we were doing, but I think after 10 years it was like we got something we could put together into an actual writing project beyond, because you publish them in peer-reviewed journals, and that's the sort of the primary way that we communicate with our colleagues. But the reality is all of us consult, we work with churches, we work with Christian colleges and universities, other institutions, and most people don't read peer reviews.
True.
But
surprising.
I don't know why, but they might read a book. And I think we thought that could be appealing. And it was it's a unique read, because it's mixed with I wouldn't want to frighten people away because there's data, but the data informs. There's a lot of stories, a lot of accounts of the people's lives. It's interspersed with the words of the students and what their life is like. And there's plenty of data if you really wanted to read up on that.
Yeah.
But it gives you the lay of the land pretty well.
It's a very enlightening read, and I enjoyed what I did read of it to prepare for the interview. So, yeah.
I think some of the things that were interesting for me, I think that one of the things we went into this, the distress levels for students, I think was one of the things that stood out to me as really a surprising thing is because as you listen to other people talk about these students without necessarily getting their voices in the mix, you would anticipate that by some people's standards that the people that we're studying would be in significant, distress across the board. And I think in looking at some of the things that we were finding, we were surprised to find that there are indeed some people that are severely distressed in this, and those cannot be ignored, and it's not downplayed at all. But the percentages of that group are not as high as we thought, and actually about half of our sample would look pretty much the same as other college students in that, and that was kind of interesting to me. That was not what I expected going into this, but it was one of those things that stood out in our stuff that was kind of a fascinating new look for me.
Yeah, I'd love to hear from each of you, Dr. Yarhouse and Dr. Dean, if there are what things stood out to you from your research.
Well, that was one to me as well. I mean, so,
Sure.
I mean, we're all in circles where the prevailing view is that Christian colleges, Christian universities must be nearly kind of toxic environments or almost like a public health risk to students who are gay or who are navigating same-sex sexuality. And so to me, that's an empirical question. So is that the case? And to see the range of experiences and results in the measures was, in some ways, was encouraging. I mean, some people come to the colleges because those colleges, the policies and the theology, the ethics undergirds their own commitments, and so they want to be in those communities. Other students, would disagree with those theological positions around sexual ethics and policies and so on and so forth, but they go for other reasons. And so, there's not one student that would capture, anybody can comment on a Christian college, but that's one point of view. And when you do studies, you find that there's a range of opinions and experiences among the very students people are advocating for. So that again stands out, just how nuanced we're talking about when we talk about this population.
For sure.
And looking at that, it's actually, I guess, the involvement with the campus that's maybe been the most interesting to me. Definitely the level of distress. But, when we look at policies, to see that it's really just maybe a third of students who vocally disagree with the policies of their institutions. And when we talk to them, most of them didn't want the theological stance to change. What they wanted is more clarity on what they were allowed to do and what they weren't allowed to do. And I don't know that that's necessarily the perception that we have of these schools. Yeah. I think about that, and then I think about how do attitudes toward these schools change when students graduate. And I was really surprised to see that most students think more favorably of their school after they leave. Because
that was really interesting.
Because I think I hear, that students, these sexual minority students suffer through 4 years at this school, and then they're so glad that they're done. And sure, I'm sure that there are students who have that response, but the overall data suggests actually that they leave the school and they feel better about the school when they're done. Yeah. And so that was a surprise to me. I think the other thing that we heard, maybe the interviews, but just, I guess, a counter narrative, if you will, that students aren't really, and we've seen this all the time that we've been doing this research, they're not really hearing a lot of negative comments from faculty and staff.
Mm-hmm. That's good.
That the negative comments and the jokes and the derogatory remarks come peer to peer, but they're not coming from employees. Mm-hmm. And I think that's not what the world wants to tell us
Right.
about this kind of environment.
And I think one of the things that comes out in the qualitative research is that to some degree there seems to be, when it comes to those offensive or microaggressions and those kind of things that are associated with Christian communities, Christian academic communities, it seems to get better as the students age.
Interesting.
And so I guess to be more clear about that, one of the funny things that came out in one of the interviews was a student said, now when people come in as freshmen, you just have to understand they don't know how to negotiate this topic very well. And so we just don't listen to them. This is another student talking to me. We just don't listen to them. They got to grow up a little bit before we
Yes.
kind of get it to the place where, and I think the word they used in the interviews, because when they're sociable enough or socialized enough to be able to, they're kind of enter into this discussion
Yes.
in a way. We just disregard them for the most part until
That's
they get to that point. But so there's a little bit of you kind of grow into learning how to do this. So there's that was one of the things that helped as I was thinking about this, is to say, at least generally speaking, the schools that are in, they are socializing people to have this conversation to some degree. They can do better. I think there still is a dominant message that schools can do better at creating place for conversation and learning around these issues. But on the other hand, there are a lot of things, and I think over the 10 years we would say in the research that schools are doing better at this. I think they're working to do better, and we see the evidence of that, although still got some work to do and still a ways to go around these things. I think the other thing for me that stands out really strongly is this idea of relationality.
That's exactly where I was going to go.
Go ahead.
No,
Go
you
ahead.
go.
I just the one piece that stands out is how important it is to have one good relationship and how that affects distress and how that affects the way they engage their experience, the way they view their experience. The idea of having someone that you can connect with, that is a friend, that someone with whom you can unpack some of these things in a way that gives you, it's not judgmental or foreclosed, but there to hear and to think with you about those kind of things. That kind of relationship means everything. The amount of variance that's associated with the relationality and some of those kind of pieces is just amazing. And then I don't know about you all as you were.
Yeah, so Steve mentioned earlier the idea of like microaggressions, but these are like subtle, maybe even unintended things that get said that just create a climate. So, imagine in a residence hall, if someone says, stop acting so gay to somebody, and there it's a derogatory term that means stop acting so stupid. Well, what's the likelihood that a freshman who's navigating these questions is likely to bring that up to their resident assistant or someone else when everybody's kind of joking in that way? So it creates that climate. It also makes it very difficult. So to Steve's point, the making it or breaking it is interpersonally mediated. Like, they're going to have these relationships that are derogatory, these unkind things that are said, or people can do what we call microaffirmations. They can have subtle things that are said. There are points of encouragement that say, you can talk to me. I do value you.
Yes.
I do see you. Those things, time and time again, were lifelines for students on campus.
That's so important. And I think not always, but sometimes with the microaggressions, they might not even be realized that that is happening by the people who are giving them. What would you say to that? And how can we not do those even unintentionally? Because that's one of my hopes for this podcast, is that we learn how to navigate this conversation better and learn to be lifelines for people who are navigating this intersection.
I think there's an element of putting ourselves in someone else's shoes. So what would it be like if this were true about me and I heard these comments? And I'm not sure that the younger students on these campuses are able to do that as well as older students are. And I think that that's one of the developmental changes that happens as they're in school. We're hoping that they begin to broaden their perspectives and think about the world in different ways and think about people other than themselves. But that is a developmental process too. But it helps. I think about this was several years ago. I was teaching a class, developmental psychology, and I don't know that I would have noticed this before I started doing this research, but to hear the assumptions made that there's only one life outcome to be happy, and that's to get married and have children. And you begin to hear this from a different perspective. And I don't think anybody in the class was attempting to kind of approach this in this heteronormative sort of way. And yet that's what they were doing. And so then how do you open their eyes to kind of see that this is the message that they were sharing at that time? And I think it involves listening to other voices and somehow, what would that be like if that were me?
Yeah.
I think students say that what helps is awareness, growing awareness. I think it fits with what Janet's saying, that those opportunities where, whether it's programmatic or other kinds of more process-related things in residence halls, or but just a sense of just there's that. I was trying to think of a good way to say this. If colleges are raising awareness that there are people that are beyond that kind of the diversity issue, these things, and it's not necessarily even making the statement that how we engage that process, which is a deeper discussion, but just the awareness that there are people that are just different than you are and I am. And we have to be aware of that, and we have to learn about that. That's part of education at a higher. That's part of higher education, is being a part of that sort of process.
As you've done your research, I don't want to cut this discussion short, so if you have anything to add, feel free before I move on to the next question. As you've done your research, what might Christian LGBTQ plus students, or those who are navigating life at the intersection of faith and sexuality, say to their Christian academic communities?
I think first of all, the one I think of is, I think they'd say, Janet mentioned that when it comes to policies, they're not necessarily looking for a change in policy. There are some that come in and want to engage that. Many of them will say, and I don't remember percentages in this. Many of them will say that they don't like certain policies that are present in that. But for me, the thing that I think comes out of the research is this sense of don't create policies that make it difficult for me to be in relationship in a way that helps me, as I negotiate this sort of thing. Now, the way I said that may sound like people are saying, I want the chance to do whatever I want to do, and that's not what I mean in this. It's more that sense of it's more a sense of I need to be able to have that one good relationship, or I need to have multiple relationships where I can grow in community. And so if there are policies and sorts of things that get in the way of that communal sort of engagement, if there are things that mean I have to be silent because of my fear, and because I don't feel safe, as Mark was talking about, if it's an environment that keeps me from being able to talk about what's real and relevant for me, and those are the things that they would like the school to understand. Think about those from our perspective. How will those things affect my ability to be in community here? Even if you don't have to change policy. You don't have to take different theological stands. But as those are enacted, think about how those might help or hinder the communal aspect that's so important in making the way for learning in this area.
I think students would also, related to that, they want, so I mentioned earlier that they want to take their faith seriously, their sexuality seriously, how they relate to each other. Well, you don't do that in isolation. That's not just a cognitive exercise you kind of figure out. I mean, to be able to process that, talk about that, A lot of students would want a space on campus or space where they could do that, while they're in these 4 years. And this is tricky. I consulted a lot of Christian colleges, and I'm often asked, should we sponsor a group? Should we have a group where students can kind of convene? And there's not a yes or no answer to that.
Correct.
On the one hand, what students want is a place to do that. Students are going to have this conversation. The question is, does an institution want to shape that, be a part of that, convene that? How do you want to do that? But students are going to talk about it anyway.
Of course.
It seems to me you want to be a part of that at some level. But the other challenge is that students don't disagree with each other. And so you convene a group of students, and they are here to talk about this part of their life. And it can be really hard when a group of students gravitate towards one maybe perspective on this topic, and maybe it's more conservative, for lack of a better word, and students who disagree with that feel kind of like that can be threatening. Or maybe students are over here, and it's a larger group of students who wish policies were different, and students who are more conservative feel like that's not safe for them sometimes. And so how are they in the same room and talking about these things together? It takes, if an institution does sponsor something like that, it takes a very wise and kind of nimble facilitator, I think, to kind of create space for everybody to be in the room. Those are things that are pretty challenging to work out.
But the goal would be to create a culture that's committed to, depending on the institution, but committed to an orthodox view of the sexual ethic while investing intentionally in the formation of the sexual minority students. Is that fair?
I think most of the schools we're reaching would say that. That's their hope.
Okay.
That's the hope, absolutely.
Yeah, and creating a culture can sometimes, be the challenge, right?
Yeah. I mean, I think we wrestle with what we talk about in the book as being these two different levels. There's kind of this macro level and this micro level of at the macro level, it involves a lot of conversations and relationships among higher level administrators and boards and constituents and donors, and there is a language and a conversation that goes on there. And then there's this micro level that's the conversation among students, and maybe students and faculty, students and staff. And sometimes there are conversations and maybe even publications that go out at the macro level that haven't really thought through the micro level and the impact of those kind of things. And then there are sometimes, of course, the other way around, where there are statements made and advocacy stances and those kind of things made at the micro level that may not, really understand the macro sort of impact of some of those kind of things. And that makes it hard. That makes it really difficult as you're living in a community and you're having to contend with both. And I think the institutions that I see doing this better are the ones where they're aware of both of those levels and are beginning to think about how do we keep communication open so that we are able to minister and educate ultimately everybody who comes to us.
Yeah.
That's that liberal arts sort of learning perspective that is a high value for all of these institutions. And so how do we make space for this kind of whole person learning?
Yes.
Is what we're after.
Yes, that's so important. This wasn't one of the podcast questions that I sent you beforehand, but Dr. Stratton and I were talking a while back about how your research can be misunderstood, and I wondered if you could kind of speak into that a little bit too.
I guess if I remember the conversation correctly, I think one of the things that I said is as we got into this research, we kind of laughingly said that sometimes our point of view doesn't please anybody. It's kind of, in some sense, sometimes the groups that are very conservative look at it and feel like we're giving away too much, and sometimes the people who are on a more liberal or progressive side might feel like we're way too conservative still and not making way for enough. And so there are some times where it's like nobody's happy with us.
Can't please everybody
in that way. But I think one of the things we have to honestly say is that we're dealing with a sample of students that and they may not be representative across every other college, university, even every other Christian college, Catholic college and university, those kind of things. This is representative of the people we've studied, and I think honestly, we have to acknowledge that we're doing our best to hear the voices of the people and to represent those voices well as we engage with them.
Even, I was just thinking of the title of the book, right? It's called Listening to Sexual Minorities. And most people's experience with this topic is more framed in almost political and sort of culture war discourse. So, like, you'll hear maybe people in different communities might say derogatory things about the gay community, like, about gays are ruining the culture, or gays are ruining marriage, or something like that. And so it frames it very differently. So the idea that we're listening will be off-putting to some people. But then the title is Listening to Sexual Minorities, and so we get pushback sometimes on just that language. Like, what do you mean by sexual minority? Are you equating them to racial minorities? And sexual minorities is just a term that is used within psychology to describe people who experience same-sex attraction independent of a label that they use, like gay or lesbian or bisexual or straight, or independent of sexual behavior that they engage in. And so for our purposes with Christian communities, it's an ideal phrase because a lot of our students don't engage in sexual behavior. Some of our students don't elect to use sexual identity labels. And so what do you call them? So this is a term that is shorthand to describe them, but other people think you're making a political statement by calling them sexual minorities, and you're leading the church down the wrong path. And of course, that's not our heart. We're just trying to use the language of our profession, but also language that really fits with the communities that we're in because of the diverse values that our sample holds.
And along with that, this book, again, is about listening to these students. We're not taking a theological stance in this book. And so I've heard some folks say, well, what do you think theologically? That's not what this particular book is about. It's about their experience. And so I think it would be wrong to look at this and think that we're trying to make some theological statement or political statement. That's not what we're doing.
It's about listening, gathering research. And when I think of listening, I think of conversation, which is what you guys have been doing with the students that you've been interviewing. So, yeah. As we move through the interview, what does your research teach us about? We talked about it a little bit, but I want to specifically ask you. So, what does your research teach us about engaging culture with a convicted civility that is also flavored with compassion?
Well, I love this phrase, and I just need to give credit where credit's due. So Richard Mao popularized that phrase, convicted civility. But when I met him, he said I actually got that from Marty, so I don't know where he got it from.
Yes, it's a beautiful phrase. That's why I borrowed it too.
We're just going to put it right there. But the idea, and it's funny to say this on the heels of what Janet just said, because we weren't making a theological position, but the idea with convicted civility is, I think Richard Mao would say we have a lot of Christians who are strong on convictions, but you wouldn't want them to represent you or the church to the broader culture because they're just not the most winsome and gracious people. On the other hand, you have Christians who are so strong on civility, you have no idea what they believe in. I think that is a difficult space for people right now. How do you model having convictions, and how do you engage other people you disagree with civility? And then I added to that the idea that we should flavor that with compassion because most people don't experience what these students experience, and so to sort of see through their eyes, experience what they experience, I think that should help us understand a little bit better our communities, our environments, what it would be like to be 12 or 13 or 14 growing up in the church and find yourself attracted to people of the same sex and try to figure out how am I going to, who do I talk to about that? Do I talk to anybody about that? And of course a lot of people don't talk to anybody about that till they leave for college, and then they leave for college, and who can I talk to there? And how do I make sense of the faith I was raised in? I mean, just to even imagine, like to Janet's point earlier, just to see the world through their eyes. that's compassion. That's takes a kind of cognitive complexity that we really want the reader to come away with.
You ask how we got into this research. I think to some degree we heard a lot of people making statements about who these students were and what they believed and what their experience was. And I know for me, I come out of a counseling center background, and as I talked with people who were negotiating and navigating this sort of thing, I thought, I don't think this voice is represented among the louder voices out there in culture. And I think that's kind of, that for me was a big part of we need to listen. We need to hear what their experience, as opposed to listening to the kind of these cultural voices that are saying, let me tell you who they are, without having listened first.
I think one of the insights that I've gotten from that and over our work, as we've worked together over these years, is what damage are those cultural voices doing to people's experience? Do you know what I mean? If other folks, if the world is telling me, or the church, whoever is saying, this is what you must be experiencing, this is how hard it must be for you, or this is how easy it must be for you, how does that then shape our experience? And what power does that have over, and what harm does that cause? And so I think there's something about maybe not dictating for somebody else what it will be like, but allowing them to experience for themselves that becomes really important.
Yeah, that's well said.
I don't know if it's fair to do this, but if there were like 3 things that we could do to navigate this conversation better. So I've gotten listening and kind of dealing with the problem of language and being aware of what our words are actually saying. Would you add anything to that if there were like 3 things that you wanted me and the people listening to be like, this is what you can do to do this better?
Well, we closed the book with some recommendations that might at least set off this discussion a little bit. But we talked about being relational, that the relationships make or break people's experiences. So focus on that. If someone were to share this story with you, thank them for trusting you with their story and honor that. That is in some ways a very sacred moment for someone to be vulnerable, given everything we've talked about. So the relationship is important. Another one is, don't assume a person doesn't have an active and vibrant faith because they're navigating this space. As we've found, they have both, and they're trying to figure it out. So we talk about being formational and really helping Christian communities take seriously these students' desire to deepen their walk with Christ. So I think one mistake Christians often make is they sort of force people to like, get this right, and then we'll talk about your relationship with Christ. I would flip that around and say, disciple them, any student who wants to know Christ more, help deepen that relationship with Christ. In fact, it's that relationship with Christ through the Holy Spirit that will likely inform future decision making. So why not invest in that?
Great statement.
So there's the relational piece, the formational, and we talk about an issue of talked about like safety, but like being emotionally safe in the room. So like I teach all the time as a professor, you teach differently when you know one of the students in your room is navigating this topic. Now I often don't know, but I go into a class assuming there will at least be 1 or 2 students who are navigating, and so you teach different, you prepare your lecture differently, and you see in our book and you'd see in our presentations, we're always drawing quotes from the actual students so that their voices are heard. Someone listening to us or reading the book would say, okay, that might not be exactly my experience, but at least they're drawing on people like me whose voices resonate. I mean, those are things that create safety, emotional safety for people, and I think that goes a long way.
I've been thinking a lot, too, about who I am when I enter into these conversations, and am I comfortable with my own faith and my own beliefs, so much so that I don't have a need to share that with someone else, so much so that I can create space in myself to hold another person's story. And what then does that look like, and how do I get there? And I think a lot of times when we enter into conversations, there's just this need to make sure that people know what I think about things. And how do I set that aside? How do I become comfortable being with anybody, no matter what they believe, without having that need to kind of force myself on them? That kind of inner hospitality. I don't know how else to say it.
Yeah. I like that idea. And I think that is something I've grown in across time. I'm always trying to be better at that. And we hear it from the students as well. It's they make a distinction oftentimes between those people who want to be in conversation, but it's like they have an end point. It's like at some point I've got to tell you that what you're doing is wrong, and this has got this has to change. I want you to know that. As opposed to those people who they may say, I understand what they believed, but it's like they were really trying to understand me, to know me, and to know me in this area, and to know me beyond this area. Mm-hmm. And it's that kind of engagement and that people are looking for. And I think the students stand out in saying to have faculty and staff and administrators who are engaging them for that reason, other than to just try to correct. I think that's powerful mm-hmm. On these campuses when there is that opportunity.
Yeah. So if we were going to take what you all have learned in your research and what you're still learning, because it's an mm-hmm. ongoing research project, what have you learned that may be helpful to the church to navigate this issue as well?
The church is tricky. One of the differences is the church is multi-generational. So you have 3 or 4 generations all converging on a Sunday morning and meeting together for worship. And it's what I mean by that is even the language that we're using, like sexual minority, gay, same-sex attracted, like the language is. People have preferences across generations for how they'll even talk about this topic. And we're just talking about how to talk about it, let alone what we decide about.
But talking about it is one of the
yeah.
first steps.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Because I think a lot of times I know I have been afraid to talk about this topic because I haven't known how to talk about it, which is why I'm really excited about this conversation because it's helpful just to me. So. Yeah. Sorry I interrupted you. No. Go ahead. I'm really bad at that.
I encourage in church settings for people to give others latitude in language and how they're going to talk about their own experiences. I think sometimes in church settings there's a added pressure to shape how the discussion is going to take place so it becomes mm-hmm. kind of top down. So only refer to yourself this way, only describe yourself this way. And we see a range of ways in which students want to talk about their experiences. And so rather than dictate the terms to the people within your church, it might be better to kind of create a space where people can gravitate to certain language. They're probably going to do that just by the cultural mores of that community, the generational differences, changing vernacular, Like I often give this example that there's no 14-year-old you're going to talk to who would ever say of their sexual orientation that they have a homosexual orientation. It's just that word has fallen out of the vernacular. But a grandparent in that same church might use that language. Mm-hmm. But a 14-year-old would say, if you ask them for some reason about their sexual orientation, which I don't recommend, they would say that they're gay. Like they would just say, because that's the vernacular.
Okay.
But to another generation, gay probably would have meant promiscuous or would have had other connotations mm-hmm. to it. Mm-hmm. So the same language will mean different things in the church. So that's something just to be, I think, just really attuned to and not mm-hmm. to crack down on, but be aware of. That would go far in a lot of church mm-hmm. settings. The emotional safety thing I talked about, just as a professor, as I teach, well, if I'm preaching from the pulpit, that's going to come across at that macro level of kind of power-based authority, and we need good preaching, but I think you preach differently when you remember that a percentage of people listening to you right now are navigating these questions. Mm-hmm. So how would you season the word that you're giving your congregation given the lived reality that there are people figuring this out right now, and some are in distress? So how would you do that differently in light of that reality? Mm-hmm. Things like that would come to my mind.
I think that makes sense. We just got back from faculty retreat where David Kinnaman was talking about Barna's research right now, and I was just fascinated because looking at the millennials and the Gen Z data that they have, that people are delaying marriage and they're staying single mm-hmm. and never married for longer. And I think one of the things that I would suggest, and I don't know that we've talked about this very much, but one of the things I would suggest is that I think the church is going to have to wrestle with how they engage singleness in a new way.
Absolutely.
And I say that because it's extremely important not to look at what that will do for students that we're looking at that are navigating this. And I think it's needed. I mean, even if that was not happening, I think this is needed, and I really appreciate the writing around that's begun to grow out of Wes Hill's work around spiritual friendship and other people that are bringing that conversation and helping the church to think about again, what does singleness mean when we have emphasized, and some people might say overemphasized at times, we become so marriage-centric within the context of our churches. And I think this is one of those things for me, and I'm not speaking for Mark or Janet here. they can nuance this better than I am probably doing this right now. But I do think, at least as we talk about here at the seminary, beginning to think with them about this is a place where we've got to do more thinking. It's been a subcategory as opposed to something that's been on our radar in a way that it's going to have to be. But I think it also ushers in a different kind of narrative for people that are navigating sexual identity and some of these issues as well. I don't know what you all think about that.
This has been something that I've seen and I've talked to folks about, is that the church seems centered around that family structure. And everything we do is around couples or families. And it just doesn't fit for many people, not only the sexual minority folks, but other folks. And then, so what would that look like? What would it look like to structure Sunday school differently or small groups differently? And how do we then build relationships and friendships that matter, right? Where there's really a truly good, intimate connection that's outside of the marriage relationship. And I don't think we know how to do that.
I think the only thing I'd add to that, I completely agree that when we overemphasize couples and families, we put an added pressure on people navigating this space, that there's kind of a two-tier way to be in the local church. You can be married and sort of at that top tier, or you can be single and sort of until you get married and you can join the top tier. But so I think of sexual minorities navigating this space as a subset of single people in the church. And if you think about it that way, not only will you help a lot of other single people, but they'll be also, you'll be speaking into their lives in meaningful ways. Otherwise, you're just putting undue pressure on them to marry heterosexually and to kind of go down that path. And that's a whole other set of questions, or to kind of act like this isn't a part of their life, or that this isn't a real, genuine topic that they're navigating. So.
It's interesting that I have seen sometimes when churches try to challenge this, that they almost begin to speak negatively about marriage. Marriage is so hard, it's so difficult. Why would you want to do that? And I really think this needs to be a both and. Marriage is good, but singleness is also good. They're both good.
Both
and I think that's hard for us to hold both in mind at the same time.
I would think the other piece, at least for me as I work with churches and think with churches about these issues, is beginning to understand that reaching out and creating ways to help persons in their sanctifying journey is something that we do because they need us in Christian community, but also we need them in Christian community. And I know, we've talked about that, and I know you had a very poignant experience, with saying to somebody, we need your story, you need to be heard, and so in that. And I think oftentimes we don't do a good job of that within the church. As a matter of fact, I've had conversations with people saying, these persons have nothing to share with me. There's nothing valuable of their experience, and I think not only is that a terrible thing to say,
yes,
it's terribly isolating and ostracizing, but it's just wrong. It's just wrong. And I think to be able to see God's sanctifying work in the heart and life of people coming at this from very different and diverse perspectives gives us a view of God and His ability to grow us and to love us into the persons He dreams of us being. And I think we lose some picture, some richness. And I think to some degree, because of the secretiveness and the way we've managed this in some areas in the church, oftentimes we don't have another narrative because we've kind of we've not seen it. We haven't created a space to see how God works in this. And so now I think sometimes we don't. If you ask people, what does this look like, the sanctifying journey for people who are sexual minorities, we kind of go, I don't know.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, again, it just seems to me that as we're thinking about the church, it's a way of being what the church is always meant to be and what we desire to be. I mean, it's not. I think that's churches really want to be transformational, and but this is a complicated issue.
Yeah.
Complicated issue for that.
Yeah. Well, I'm very grateful for your time today and the insight that you shared with us. And as we went through the questions, is there anything that you wanted to say that you didn't get a chance to speak to? And if not, that's okay. I just wanted to open up for that too. Okay.
Good questions. Thank you.
Well, thank you guys so much for taking the time to come by. So I didn't give you these, and I maybe should have, so you can be mad at me later. But our podcast is called the Thrive with Asbury Seminary podcast. So I want to ask each of you, what's a practice, spiritual or otherwise, that is helping you thrive in your life or ministry? So it can be serious, or it can just be Netflix and chill.
We talk about means of grace. I think of Netflix in that category, but that could be. It could be. I can speak for me. I think one of the things that has been so profound over the last 10 years is an investment in contemplative prayer, and that's been a real life-changing engagement for me. So much so that my wife recognizes when I'm not doing that. When I'm not engaged in that. So, and I think
you appreciate it when she points that out too.
Absolutely. Well, I don't know. It depends on how she points it out. But to be honest, I think that's it does show up. It's been one of those profound means of grace, that the way that, as Wesley talks about that idea, that an avenue that we give to God so He can administer His grace into those areas of life. And for me, that's been really pivotal. And so it's for me, that's the first thing that pops into my mind, because it's been so rich for my own formation and development.
Yeah, I love that.
So I had two pop into mind. Can I do two?
Yeah, you can do two.
One is just a really simple one. Both of these, I feel like I'm confessing. So, but over the past couple of years, I've been very intentional about being careful with my sleep. It has made a world of difference.
Really?
So we could talk about that. We could have a whole nother podcast just on that.
That is fascinating. I would love that. So what do you mean by being careful with your sleep?
Making sure that I'm getting enough sleep every night, that I'm waking up at the same time every morning.
Okay.
And just really being careful, not sacrificing that piece.
Okay.
So I don't know if you've noticed that change in me, but it's just, it matters.
Yeah.
So it's just very simple, sleep.
That's cool. I've been too sleepy to notice. So
I think the other thing more for me, I actually tend to be a very private person, although people don't know that about me, but very private person, and I have intentionally started to engage in some discipleship where I allow myself to be known, like really
that's
known.
hard.
And that's been going on for about 3 or 4 years, and it has been incredibly good for me.
Yeah.
And so anyway,
that's
so that
awesome.
would be the practice. It just something, and you go through seasons of life where you do more of that, and then you do less of that, and then more. And I'm in that place where I'm engaged in that right now, and it makes a difference.
Yeah, yeah, it does. Yeah, thank you.
Yes.
Yeah, I made a move recently, and one of my colleagues, a friend of mine from our previous church, just encouraged me to continue to do daily, weekly, monthly, and annual sort of spiritual exercises that are sort of life-giving, and it really made me think, what do I do in those rhythms? And one thing that I do, at least annually,